Viruses are not actually placed in one of the 6 kingdoms because they're not considered to be living things. And that's just kind of the commonly held belief right now. But I'll let you decide for yourself whether you think they should be considered living or not. Some of the common viruses that we see are the H1N1 virus, which is swine flu. There's a picture there of that virus under a microscope. A bacteriophage is a common kind of virus that infects only bacteria cells. And HIV is the virus that causes the symptoms of AIDS. And there's a picture there of that virus. So you can see that viruses come in lots of shapes and sizes. They're very different from one virus to another. And they come in those different shapes and sizes because they're made to infect a particular kind of cell, like a bacteriophage will only infect bacteria cells, and so they're very specific in which cells they will attack. Now, the parts of a virus are pretty simple. They're made of a protein coat, which is called a capsid. There's a picture of a bacteriophage but virus here, that's why it looks kind of like a spider. But the whole outer coating is the capsid, and it's made of protein. And then inside the capsid we have the genetic material, which for a virus can either be DNA or RNA, but it will never be both. They'll always either have DNA or RNA. And that genetic material is the squiggly line there inside of the capsid. Now we're going to look at viral reproduction, which is a pretty interesting process. We're going to look at viral reproduction by using an example of a bacteriophage. And so since this virus is a bacteriophage, it means it attacks only bacteria cells. It won't attack a regular cell, just a bacteria cell. Alright, so we're going to start at the very beginning of viral reproduction, where the virus actually attaches itself to the outside of the bacteria cell, and it's going to inject its genetic material, whether that's DNA or RNA, into the cell. So you can see the yellow viral DNA entering the cell there. And then what's going to happen is that the viral DNA is going to attach itself to the bacterial DNA. And since this happens to be a bacteria cell, we'll call it bacterial DNA, but whatever kind of cell it is has its own DNA, and the virus will attach its DNA to that DNA. And so it sort of fools it into thinking that the virus's DNA is part of that cell. And then what will happen is those regular bacteria cells will go ahead and reproduce just like normal, but instead of just reproducing, they're also reproducing or copying the viral DNA. And so every new cell that's reproduced after that will contain that viral DNA. And so you'll end up with lots and lots and lots of cells with the viral DNA attached to it. Now, we call this cycle the lysogenic cycle because really nothing bad has happened yet. The bacteria is just reproducing like normal, doesn't realize anything is wrong. And so your bacteria are multiplying, you're getting lots of these bacteria that have been infected. But at some point, the viral DNA will become lytic, and instead of staying in the lysogenic cycle and just reproducing, it's going to move over into the lytic cycle. And so the lytic cycle happens when we cross over here, and the viral DNA separates from the bacterial DNA, and it starts to take over the instructions of the cell. And so it tells the cell to start producing proteins to make viruses. So this is where the cell actually changes its function, and it starts to produce proteins that will assemble inside of the cell to make viruses. And then after a while, that cell will become so full of viruses that it'll have to break open. And when the cell breaks open, we say that it lyses. That's the word for breaking open. And it releases all those viruses out into the outer area around the cell. And they'll go off and try to infect another cell. And the whole thing will start over again. And they'll go and infect another cell and inject their DNA into it, and it'll just keep repeating. Now, some viruses will stay in the lysogenic cycle for a long time, and if you're one of those people who are infected by one of those viruses, you don't know anything is wrong until that viral DNA becomes lytic and moves over into the lytic cycle. And when it starts producing viral DNA and viruses and your cells start bursting open, that's when you start noticing symptoms and realizing that you're sick. So it can be very dangerous because the more cells that get produced in the lysogenic cycle, the more of them are going to be destroyed when they enter the lytic cycle. So it can be very harmful in that way. Now, there is some debate over whether or not viruses are living things, and so we're going to look at some of the qualifications of living things. So let's ask the question, are viruses alive? The first qualification for life that most people agree upon is that living things should be able to reproduce. In viruses, you might say they can reproduce, but they can only reproduce if they have a host cell. They don't have the things inside of them that they need to be able to reproduce on their own. And so you might argue that because they can't reproduce on their own, then they're not living. The second qualification for life is that living things should be able to grow and go through a life cycle and eventually die. And so they kind of go through these stages in life. But we could say that viruses actually don't grow. They're assembled inside of the host cell, and so they don't actually go through stages. They just go from being nothing to being a virus. And once they're assembled, they actually cannot die. You can't kill a virus. You can rid yourself of the virus, get it to go away, but you can't kill it. And you can also develop immunity to the virus. That's what vaccines are for, but you can't kill it. Living things should use energy. That's the next qualification for life, that everything that's living needs energy. Well, viruses don't actually use energy. They don't have mitochondria to be able to do cellular respiration to effectively use energy, so they can't do that. So you might say that they're not living. The fourth qualification for life is that living things should be able to adapt to their environment. Well, viruses actually can adapt in a way. They can go dormant when their environment is unfavorable, and so you could say that they're sensitive to their environment, but there is some argument there that that's just a natural process, that the virus isn't doing it on purpose. And then the last thing that makes something living is that living things should be made of cells, and viruses are actually not made of cells. They're simpler than a cell. They're made only of protein. They're an outer protein coat, and then the nucleic acid is inside of the protein coat. And so they're just made of these two very simple things. And so we could say that they're not living because they're not made of cells. So this is some of the evidence that people use to show that viruses are typically considered to be non-living. But you could make a pretty good argument to say that they are living.